feedback and also open to criticism, right? Delegation. This is a big problem that I see with founders. They want to do everything themselves. That doesn't scale. You have to ultimately be able to, and this is like giving up your baby. My brother is an entrepreneur and he has a very interesting insight from me. He says you should always hire people who are younger, hungrier, and smarter than you. You should be the dumbest person in the company as the CEO. And that is threatening. Just like in a relationship, you don't want a partner who's smarter than you. This is a big battle. People say, I want a smart woman, but not too smart. She should not be smarter than me. So if you're a really smart woman, you have a problem. So that's the thing with CEOs too. They get threatened, they get intimidated by people who are smarter than them. But let that go, because they're going to teach you a few things. And younger, why? Because they know what's going on in the world of technology today. And hungrier because they don't, people, if they don't have a life, they'll work harder. If they have a life, a wife and family, then, they get slowed down. So, which is okay if you're a senior executive, or you want young and hungry people, that's the best way to go. Communication and risk-taking, right? And humility. Humbleness is very, very important. So those are the traits of a good CEO. And what do people want? Beyond the founding team, the people that you hire, they want fair compensation. By the way, fair compensation doesn't mean the highest compensation. They want to know they've been treated fairly. And this goes with equity too. With equity, one piece of advice I can give you is that the size of the pie wins every time over the share of the pie. So give generously to people. Because if you build $1 billion or $100 million in value, even if you own 5% of it, there's plenty of money. But if you own 100% of zero, that's still zero. Okay? So that's something. And what people want is freedom. They want freedom to execute with excellence. You want to let them go. You want to be able to, and freedom to take risks. Freedom to fail. Because you want them. In fact, I was at Facebook a few months ago, and, teaching them product management. And I saw the signs all over the room. You know what the sign said? Move fast and break things. Go break things. As a CEO, you should encourage your people to break things, which means taking risks, experimenting, right? And people want a piece of the action and a fun place to work. So that's the team, okay? Now, also you need directors and advisors. When you're starting up a company initially, don't worry about directors. They come later. What's most critical is the advisors. And advisors serve a specific purpose. You need advisors on strategy, you need advisors with connections, and you need advisors with money. So I would say you need an advisory board of 6 to 8 people, initially, who will bring in these different skill sets. And the best thing you can do is if your advisors are investors and your investors are advisors. You get 2 for the price of 1. Eventually, you'll need a board of directors, and this board of directors starts out with investors, but ultimately you need to bring independents on board. And the independent directors, you get closer to public markets. So I'm an independent director on a company which was pre-IPO and now it's been public for 6 years. So I've seen that company go from there to, so the reason you need to bring in independent directors when you get to the public markets. Regulators require it. Okay, now let's talk about the plan, the business plan, the dreaded plan. Why do you need a plan? A plan, by the way, I always believe that planning is more important than the plan. The plan, forget about it. But the process of planning forces you to think logically, think systematically, because you need it as a roadmap. Investors will ask for it. The team, it serves to articulate to the team where we are at. And it's also a good way to score yourself. Because there's this famous saying from Alice in Wonderland, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. Right? So a plan is a roadmap, and a roadmap you can measure progress and you can measure. But a plan should be flexible. A plan is a living document. A plan is not something that's set in stone. And to me, above all, a plan is a story. It's a story of your story. In fact, the best way to write a plan is to write a 1-paragraph story about your business, what it's going to be, right? So that's the notion, right? And then there's about how long should it be? Well, you know what Einstein said, make things as simple as they should be, but no simpler. So make a plan as short as it can be, but no shorter. Here's some sort of tips. If I am reading page 6 of your plan and I still don't know what you're doing, you've got a problem. I should have, within the first paragraph, the executive summary, I should sit up and take notice and say, wow, this is cool. So get to the point quickly. Tell me what problem you're solving. What is the business? Who are the customer? What is the customer problem? That all needs to come up early. What's compelling? What's unique? How are you going to make money? So all these things need to come up very quickly. And by the way, it's very important to also offer a snapshot of here's what my company is going to look like 12 months, 24 months, 36 months from now. What's the roadmap for evolution? What are my projections? What are the core assumptions? By the way, you should always, I believe, assumptions are far more important than forecasts because forecasts are based on assumptions. So you should know the 4 or 5 critical assumptions that your plan pivots on. If these assumptions turn out to be false, then we don't have a business. And then you have to convince me that you have a plan to figure out or validate those assumptions. Okay? And that also goes for risk factors. That's what needs to be in a plan, right? And what not to do, is to forget about your audience. If your audience is a venture capitalist, they get 10,000 plans in a year, they fund 10 companies. So if you don't tell them what the story is, and if you don't make it compelling, they're not going to read any further, right? Also, sometimes people just focus on technology. That's not interesting. Another thing that they do is they use a lot of technical buzzwords and jargon. People are not, write your plan in English. People need to be able to understand what you're saying in English. You may be the world's greatest developer, but I'm not interested in the technology. I'm interested in the problem that you're solving, right? And also, here's a very common mistake I see in plans. Gartner research says that the market for knowledge management is $1 billion. I will get 1% of it, so my sales forecast is therefore $10 million. That, by the way, Gartner doesn't know what the hell it's talking about to begin with, right? And this top-down approach of X% of $1 billion is nonsense. Build it ground up. Here's a customer, here's how much value I'm going to create for them, here's how much they're going to pay me, here's how many customers I can get in the first 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, build it up from the ground. Don't go top-down. Top-down is always too optimistic. Okay? And also sort of, don't worry about your valuations. Valuation is, people get caught up in this too early. In the early stage, there's no valuation. What you have to do is to simply raise money on debt and then convert it. I'll talk a little bit more about that in raising money, right? Also, please don't have spelling mistakes in your plan. Okay? So this is what a plan includes. I'm not going to describe these. I just want to list this. By the way, we can make this presentation available to you so that you don't have to make notes and stuff. So we'll put it in the cloud or post it somewhere for you. Okay? So now, one thing about projections. When you're a startup at the early stage, how do I know what my revenues are going to be? How do I know what my projections are going to be? So that's why we call it pro forma. Pro forma means as if or an approximation. And these financials are not meant to be precise, but they are meant to actually articulate the assumptions that you're making. Right? For example, let's say you start a company. This is an actual company. I'll use an example. It's called eFax. eFax is a cloud-based faxing service. Okay, so now eFax, what they say is that we will have a freemium model, that you can send faxes for free up to 3 pages, and then beyond that you have to pay. Or you can send 3 faxes a month for free, and after that you have to pay. So in my forecast, what are some of the critical parameters? Percentage of people who send faxes more than 3 pages long. Percentage of people who are going to upgrade from free to premium. Number of faxes, average number of faxes sent per month. Average length of the fax. Those are all the parameters, the average uptake rate from free to premium. Those are the parameters that will drive the projections. So you really need to focus on the assumptions and the pivot points and the sensitivity analysis. That's what's in the pro forma, right? And it all needs to make sense. You need to evaluate the consistency. For example, if you've got a plan and I look at it and your sales projections and I work backwards from, let's say you're an enterprise sales, you're an enterprise technology company. You're creating some piece of software that a large company is going to buy. And in your projections, I noticed that in the first year you're projecting 40 customer accounts. Now, I asked myself, 40 customer accounts, for an enterprise company, your sales cycle is typically 12 months. And you need about 20 sales visits in order to close a deal over 12 months. Now, you do the math. If there's 40 accounts you want, how many sales calls do you have to make? At least 800. By the way, that's to close the deals. If your deal closure rate is 25%, it's actually 800 times 4, 3,200 sales calls. And then I see in another part of your plan, I have 2 salespeople. The math doesn't add up. So if you're going to make 3,200 sales calls, and an average person can probably make a sales call a day, right? Or maybe 2 a day. So your capacity is 25 sales calls for 1 salesperson. You need a salespeople of team of 100. So don't put out idiotic plans like this where I look at one part of it and look at another part of it and say, this doesn't add up to this. Either your margins, or there was another example. I met this company, I said, what do you do? He said, we're building this piece of software for Global 2000. So I said, what's your average deal size? He said, $50,000. I said, right now I'm not interested in investing in your company. You do the math, $50,000 and your target market is the Fortune 500. You sell to everybody, what is your revenue? Not enough. If you are an enterprise company, if you're selling some software to enterprise, show me $1 million customer. Show me $1 million deal size. If you have a $50,000 deal size, then you're targeting the mid-market because then you have to have 1 million customers. So that's what I mean. Internal consistency is really important as you look at the projections, right? And you got to think about the risks. One of the other mistakes entrepreneurs make is they will hide the risks. Well, I'm not stupid. I can figure out what the risks are. So be honest. Tell me these are the risks. These are the risk factors because then I know that you're actually thinking about mitigating the risks as you go along. Okay? Let's talk about the money. So in money, the typical sequence is, by the way, first is your credit cards. Okay? Nowadays, entrepreneurs have this false notion that all money is OPM, other people's money. When I look at an entrepreneur, I ask them, how much have you put in? What is your skin in the game? And your skin in the game both has to be financial as well as sweat equity. Then you go to friends and family. If you have rich friends and family, that's good. But at the very end, those are the people who will believe in you. But why do you go to friends and family? Because they'll invest even though they don't understand what you're doing, right? Just because they like you, and you can lose their money, and they'll still be friends and family. So that's where you go, right? The next step is angels. And at angel stage, you're typically raising a couple $100,000, and these angels again are not sophisticated investors, but they're people who have some expertise and who have some money and so on and so forth. Venture investors come Series A onward, then you have Series A, B, C, and so on, and then later you can get to mezzanine rounds, strategic investors, private equity, and ultimately public markets. So some tips on raising money. As I said, put some skin in the game. Always go for size of the pie over share of the pie. Be generous when you're giving away equity initially. Now here's a very interesting paradox. I met an entrepreneur and he said, I am so excited. I was expecting a $5 million pre-money valuation. I got a $10 million pre-money valuation. I said, that's the worst thing you've done to yourself. Why? In the next round, can you guarantee a $25 million valuation? Because if you go from a $10 million valuation to a $7 million valuation in the next round, it's called a down round, that is fatal. So initially, actually be conservative. Leave some money on the table so that you can continue to show the increase in the valuation in subsequent rounds, right? Also, don't value the company in the angel round. Neither the angel nor you know what the hell the valuation is. So the best way instrument is you just get a promissory note from them saying we're going to give you 6%, 8%, 10% interest rate on your loan. It's a loan. And then when a first professional investor comes in, we'll convert it into equity and we'll give you a sweetener of 25% or 50% because you came in early. Don't let the professional investors value the company. Okay? Smart money is worth a huge valuation discount. I would much rather take smart money. Smart money is coming from investors who can give you strategic value add over and above just money, right? Also remember, I've seen more startups die of indigestion than of starvation. They raise too much money too early and they choke on it. Lack of money builds character. Because you get focused. When you're hungry, you're focused. When you're fat and lazy, you go to sleep. Right? So I've seen companies get too much venture financing too early because the market was hot, and then they hired receptionists and they had foosball tables and they had slides going down, and who's doing any work? There are people supervising the work. So you have to be careful. And also, don't raise money when you need it. Raise money when you can. Because people will give you money when you don't need it. And when you need it, it's going to be a lot tougher. And it takes much longer and takes far more effort to raise money than you think. Right? So that's some thoughts on money. Lastly, on execution. So there's some interesting challenges as you start building a startup. One is the idea of flexibility versus focus. Right? On the one hand, I want to be really focused on an opportunity. On the other hand, I also want to be flexible in case that opportunity turns out not to be what I wanted to do. Right? Or the target market is different. Service versus product. Services are great for putting food on the table. They make money early, but products are great for scaling. So how do I manage that trade-off? And the third is opportunism versus deliberation. Initially, you need to be opportunistic with your customer base, but then how do you become strategic about the target markets? So I just wrote an article on this subject. I call it 5 shifts in scaling startups. The interesting insight here is that the very things that you need to do as an early stage startup will kill you if you continue to do those things. So these are reversals. So here's an example. Initially, who are your customers? Anybody who will do business with you. Fine, it's okay. You have to be opportunistic. Go left, right, with this game we used to play, the blind man's buff. Just go and get customers. Then you look after a while, okay, the last 10 clients I got, 8 of them are insurance companies. Maybe the insurance market is telling me something. So now I'm in the insurance vertical. Then you become strategic. Okay? Now if you're opportunistic too long, you will spread yourself way too thin. You'll have customers all over the place and no focus. But if you are too strategic too early, you may make the wrong bet because you're too narrow too quickly. So that's the first shift, from opportunistic to deliberate. Start with projects. Projects put food on the table. But eventually, and by the way, the other thing about the project, when you go to a customer and do a project for them, you know that there's a problem that you're solving that's of value to them. Learn from those projects and then build products. So the mantra I think about here is that you servicize to learn, productize to earn. You use services to learn, and then you productize that because you're learning from your customers and you're also putting food on the table. Ownership to partnership. Initially, you want to own everything yourself, your sales force, your channels, and so on. But later, if you want to scale, you have to partner. Use partners to get scale. For your go-to-market strategy, you can leverage other people's customer bases, other people's routes to markets to scale yourself quickly. So that partnering becomes a very important strategy in scaling. From people to process. Initially, it will be people and their passion that will drive the company. But people don't scale. When you want to grow a company and beyond a certain point, you need to put process into place. You need to systematize it, put methods, whether it's a sales management process or a customer account management process, or financial process, or operations processes. Process is not a 4-letter word. And the last thing is relationship to brand. When I meet B2B startup companies, I said, what's your brand? It's just a relationship. It's people know me. But if you want to scale, then you have to build a brand. You have to invest in marketing because a brand becomes a proxy for a relationship to a customer who doesn't know you. Otherwise, you're only in the high-touch space. And if you're at high-touch, you can't scale. So these are some scalability issues that you need to deal with. Early stage, do something. Late stage, you got to actually reverse it. All right, so that's what I had to say about the startup. I want to now just spend a few minutes talking about the startup scene in India and what I see as the next generation. Because I am frustrated, personally, I've been involved with Indian IT companies for many years, that no big products have come out of India. Big services have come out of India. The Infosys, Cognizant, Wipro, blah, 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 TCS, so on. But name a product, right? Have we built the iPod? Have we built a Google? Have we built something? No, we haven't. What's going on? Let's see. So India clearly is the world leader in IT initially and now BPO. And I'm on the board of a BPO and analytics company. So it's IT services, BPO, and then KPO, or analytics, or whatever you want to call it. So India does really well there. These are some statistics and some numbers from NASSCOM and so on, right? But where are the products? If you think about product startups, India's software exports is less than 5% of the total service, the IT exports. And India is, there are 3,400 product startup companies in India, but the average revenues are less than $600,000. So really, very few of them have made it big. And software product exports have not grown. Their CAGR is 10%. And yet, when you look at companies, the other developing markets, China, India, Russia, they're ahead in product revenues. Even the Indian IT majors, if you look at large companies like Infosys and so on, iFlex and Finacle and banking system like banks from TCS, these are some of the only products, and these are this is not a consumer or household name. So, and they've done a really good job with services, but they haven't invested in product development because product development requires a different approach, a different culture, a different mindset. Okay? And this is the evolution that I think that the Indian IT industry needs to go through. Initially, we did body shopping. Then we started to manage projects. Now we run business processes. But that's the next stage. We got stuck here. Now we need to get to products. Okay? And here's why. The problem with the services companies, it scales linearly. IT services, you tell me how many people you have, I'll tell you what revenues you have. You tell me how many people you're adding, I'll tell you how much revenue you're adding. Because it's a very standard formula. BPO is 25,000 per FTE, and in software is 40,000 per FTE. That's it, plus minus couple $1,000. So that's not fun. It's good business. By the way, it has been a good business. TCS has a $70 billion valuation. All that's good. But you will never build a $200 billion valuation. You will never build a Google or a Facebook, with services. Because products have this beautiful scalability that's exponential. The problem is initially they require a lot of investment, but they scale non-linearly. I was in Israel 6 months ago. I was teaching a group of people, and I visited some of these startup companies. These are all startups from Israel. You will recognize some of these names. Checkpoint, Viber, MagicJack. You guys all use MagicJack. Outbrain, Waze, Gigya, Conduit, BillGuard. I mean, these are all companies that have several hundred million to several $billion valuations. Why is it that Israel can do it? What is it about them? They actually don't do services. They build products. By the way, we need to send everybody to the army. That's a good start, But that's, so that's actually the culture of fighting. Menachem Begin, who used to be the Prime Minister of Israel, had a very interesting quote. He said, "We fight, therefore we are." We exist because we fight. And that's what you see in Punjab also. Why people are more entrepreneurial in Punjab? If you're not entrepreneurial, you'll be dead. Because every invader comes through Punjab and walks all over people. So you have to become tough. So that's what Israel, that culture of fighting. By the way, what is entrepreneurship? It's fighting against odds. So that culture. So there's an entrepreneurial mindset and what they call in Yiddish, chutzpah. It's really having the guts to dream big, think big, and act big. And the military service, right? Also, a lot of security software has come out of Israel. Why? Because the Israeli Defense Forces is a leading edge customer. They push hard. Some of the technology that is being developed for the IDF is some of the most advanced stuff in the world. Okay? Also, strong connections with financial aid, financial community, and some very innovative funding assistance from the government. The government will actually fund your startup. You can apply for an equity loan. So all this is, so there are some unique characteristics, but there are things that we can still learn, right? So why does India lag? For one simple reason, the services are less risky, and Indian companies tend to be risk averse. I remember talking about this was 7, 8 years ago, with Mr. Premji at Wipro. I said, why don't you do products? He said, why would I do products? I got 40% margin, 60% growth. What am I worried about? Why would I put money in? I only have $3 billion of cash on my balance sheet. I'm not interested in putting that at risk. So that's kind of the, and in fact, success of the Indian IT software services companies became the barrier for product innovation because they don't need to. They're not hungry enough. And also, the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Product companies require an entrepreneurial ecosystem because a services company, you can set it up in your garage, get a few projects, and get it going. I still remember 10 years ago, I met this fellow. He runs a retail trading operation, just like a very traditional family. And he comes to me and he says, "Ek BPO lagana hai." It's as if like you're opening a Lala shop somewhere. So, this is like you have to set up a BPO just like they're, like a Kirana store. So that's kind of the culture. But a product company doesn't work like that. It's like you got to raise money, invest in product development, invest ahead of revenues. That is why you need a startup ecosystem. You need a whole ecosystem around you, and that ecosystem is being developed. That's why this educational institution is a part of building. But they're not building an institution, they're building an ecosystem. An ecosystem includes funding, it needs professional services, it needs the mentoring, it needs really sort of a critical mass of services around you, around the entrepreneur. And that's kind of what the vision at Voxen is all about, right? Because it's not just something a product startup can't be sitting alone by themselves, okay? But there is enormous opportunity. First of all, as I said, all the infrastructure is available to you in the cloud. And now we're living in this world of the app economy where you can build product applications really, really quickly. Plus, and here's a very interesting idea I want to leave with you, is the domestic market in India can be a valuable proving ground and you can arbitrage. How does this work? Let me explain the idea of the arbitrage, people arbitrage play. See, if you want to create a company like Waze, right, or Snapchat, what are they selling? Eyeballs. Well, India has a lot of eyeballs, and they're cheap. So what you do is you buy 1 million Indian eyeballs. They're cheaper. Then you go to the US and say, I have 1 million customers. And you start building your customer base there. This is arbitrage, because now you built this million customer base at a much lower cost than it would cost you to acquire 1 million customers in the US. And by the way, then you can trade the Indian multiples for the US multiples, and you're off to the races. This is what VMark is doing. You know, VMark is now in IITs and their IIMs and so on. And I've told Salil, their CEO, I said, get to 1 million people. Race to 1 million. Once you have 1 million, who cares if they're Indian? Then you go to venture firms in the US, I got 1 million customers. And by the way, once you got 1 million customers, you've tested out scalability, your proposition. It's much easier then to move into that market, right? So these are some examples. Like these guys I met, Market Simplified. Market Simplified builds a user interface for that it sells to brokerage houses for making it easy for people to trade stocks and so on. So they built up a base of 1 million customers in India. Now they're going to Fidelity and Schwab